Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.
Hello and welcome everyone to Read Smart, the official podcast for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction 2025. Over the coming weeks, we'll be meeting each of the 6 shortlisted authors in contention for this year's award in the run-in to our announcement of the winner on the 4th of November this year. As always, we're very grateful to the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous support of this podcast. Today, it's a great pleasure to be joined by the travel writer, historian and journalist Justin Marozzi, whose book Captives and Companions, A History of Slavery and the Slave Trade in the Islamic World has been shortlisted for this year's award. Justin is a best-selling author and historian whose work spans the Muslim world where he's lived and worked for much of his career. From warrior kings like Tamerlane to the father of history, Herodotus, his books bring the past vividly to life. His award-winning titles include Baghdad, City of Peace, City of Blood, and The Man Who Invented History. His latest book, Captives and Companions, explores 1,500 years of enslavement across 3 continents, blending deep historical knowledge with modern reportage. It was praised by one Baillie Gifford Prize judge as tremendously well written, thoroughly investigated, and extremely well put together. So, let's hear a bit more from Justin. Justin, welcome and congratulations on your shortlisting for this year's award.
Thank you very much, Toby, and very good to join you this afternoon.
So let's just jump straight in. What led you to write Captives and Companions?
Well, about 25 years ago, when I wrote my first book, that was a travel book and history, and it was traveling by camel across the Libyan Sahara, and it was very much in the footsteps of the old slave trade routes. So that was the first introduction to me for some of the old 19th century accounts of the Saharan slave trade in action. And then for the following, 20 years or so, the slave trade has always cropped up in the margins in other works. You mentioned Tamerlane earlier, so there's a lot of slavery in that as well. And then I think over time, I came to wonder, was there a book about the longue durée of the slavery and the slave trade in the Islamic world? And really, it tends to have been treated by academics more episodically, books about concubines, books about eunuchs, books about Ottoman slavery, but not so much the long history of enslavement and the slave trade for a general reader. So that's what I really thought there would be a possibility to have a look at that and try to write something for the general reader.
As you say, Captives and Companions charts the history of slavery in the Islamic world and it has a very big sweep from the medieval ages to the present. What are the challenges of writing a narrative on quite such a large chronological canvas?
Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of challenges involved with that. I think one of the big ones for me was an attempt to master the sources across the different periods. So, one moment you're looking at the Prophet Muhammad and early Islam. Several hundred years later, it's the Abbasid Caliphate, 500 years in Baghdad, onto the Ottomans, modern slavery. So, there's obviously an enormous amount of literature on all those different periods. And the challenge, I think, throughout going back to this kind of mythical figure, perhaps, the great general reader, trying to make it comprehensible and engaging and compelling at the same time as giving the sources their proper weight and importance.
Tell us a little bit more about those sources. Where did you go and how hard was it in particular to give the enslaved themselves their voice in this book?
I think getting to the voices of the enslaved was one of the hardest things. And it reminds me, there was an Israeli historian called Ehud Toledano who is specialized in the history of Ottoman slavery. And the titles of one of his books is As If Silent and Absent. And that refers really specifically to the difficulty of getting the voices of the enslaved themselves. In the Atlantic slave trade, there tend to be the serious crop of first-person memoirs, and there is a small equivalent of that in the slavery in the Islamic world, but almost overwhelmingly that it tends to be white Christian Europeans who survived their adventure in the Mediterranean, got back to Europe, also to North America, and wrote their very sort of self-dramatizing, sensationalist narratives. But for the more typical slave in the Muslim world, they just aren't those type of sources. In recent years, historians have started looking at court records, disputes, correspondence maybe between a slave owner and the slaves he uses in the Sahara, for example, who are trading. But again, it's very difficult. It's few and far between. I remember coming across one in the 19th century, a concubine who'd taken her owner to court. And it's a very harrowing story of how this very unscrupulous man raped her, made her pregnant, tried to get rid of her, and she had the strength and the resilience to take him to court. And we only know about her story because she did that. But at the same time, that made me think, what about all the other many untold numbers of women who never went to court, and their voices we will never be able to hear from.
I mean, presumably this book contains quite big linguistic challenges as well for you.
Yeah, I mean, Arabic would be the main one, and my Arabic is kind of serviceable, but should be better. Ottoman Turkish, non-existent. Lots of European languages, much more accessible. And I think increasingly there is more and more in translation as well. And then I think finally I wanted to supplement all of that with some kind of on-the-ground reportage, speaking both to historians and in a very specific case, which we might come on to later, the voices of formerly enslaved men and women themselves, to kind of bring the story into the present, but also hear from historians in their own words, I think, about, and how they feel that the history has been covered in their own countries as well.
Well, yes, which again anticipates my sort of next question, really. I mean, why do you think this aspect of slavery, this dimension of the story of enslaved peoples, has received so little attention in comparison to the transatlantic slave trade, for example?
Well, I think things have definitely moved on in recent decades. There was a time when Bernard Lewis, I think back in probably the 80s or 90s, said, British-American historian, he described it as professionally hazardous for young scholars to get into this terrain. I don't think that's the case anymore, but I do think that there's an awfully long way to go. One historian described the early years of the Turkish Republic as a regulated amnesia in terms of looking back to the stories of what had happened in the Ottoman Empire, including slavery. And I always remember the words of a young Turkish historian. We were discussing slavery in the Ottoman Empire, and she said when she'd approached the man she wanted to be her PhD supervisor, talking to him about wanting to look at Ottoman war captives, he just sort of brushed it aside with the words, "My dear, our ancestors treated their slaves very well. You don't need to waste your time with this." So I think on the one hand, maybe there's some parochialism in the West or sensitivity, and possibly, without wanting to generalize too much, in certain quarters, some denial about the legacy of slavery in a number of countries.
Is it possible to summarize or to encapsulate the differences between slavery in the Islamic world and the transatlantic slave trade?
In many ways, I think it's a richer, more complicated, often bewilderingly so field, because you have to deal with things that just seem completely counterintuitive or put the institution of slavery on its head. For example, a slave soldier who can found a ruling dynasty. It just makes no sense, especially when we view slavery through the more classic Atlantic slave trade prism. And I think more broadly, that something that always fascinated me was the possibility, the strong possibility in the Islamic world of the opportunity for promotion. And you see that in the earliest days of Islam with a very famous enslaved Ethiopian called Bilal. Both his parents were enslaved. He was born into slavery. And then through the course of his life, he became one of the Prophet Muhammad's closest companions and the first caller to prayer. So to this day, he enjoys an incredibly distinguished position in the annals of early Islam. More than 1,000 years later, you have enslaved Greeks, Albanians, people from the Caucasus who rise to the very top of the Ottoman bureaucracy. They're enslaved, at some point manumitted, we don't always know when, and they can rise to the very top of societies. I interviewed his great-grandson, the historian Edem Eldem. His great-grandfather was enslaved as a 3-year-old toddler, and then by 1877 he was the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, literally number 2 in the Ottoman Empire.
So tell us a little bit about the contemporary aspect of the book, your own experience of travel. I mean, what made you decide to highlight modern slavery in the book? And does it differ in any way from the earlier versions of slavery that you're describing?
I think it may be the journalist in me that, the sort of DNA of the hack, who wanted to take the story into the 21st century, but with a more conventional historian's hat on. It was taking the story, taking the historical narrative into the present day, if it justified itself. And I think it did, because in both Mali and Mauritania, which seems astonishing to say in 2025, but there is hereditary racialized slavery that still exists, albeit on a very reduced scale, but you can still find it. Needless to say, neither government would wish you to investigate it. But in Mauritania, I interviewed this really remarkable woman called Habi Rabah, who had been enslaved until 2008. And she was only rescued by her brother, who himself had escaped his slavery, with a police officer and an anti-slavery activist. the video of that sort of raid almost is online, and you can see her. She's so traumatized. She denies being enslaved, and she tells her brother, to get lost. And the policeman said, nothing to see here. I'm not a slave. And she later said she was just so terrified that she would be, whipped or beaten. She had a horrendous story of enslavement as a child. She'd been routinely beaten and raped by her master. But now, with her liberation, she dedicated the rest of her life to fighting slavery, and she'd stood for Parliament twice. So she really, again, that story of resilience, she'd overcome that incredible torment and torture of enslavement as a younger child to take her place, in Mauritanian society.
Who in that particular instance was enslaving her?
It was a family who was sort of living in the margins of the desert. It is illegal, formally so, but the activists I spoke to in Mauritania would routinely said that one of the reasons it still exists is because those in power are the worst perpetrators. People in positions of political power, economic and social positions of influence, etc., are the ones who maintain it because they don't want to get rid of the institution of slavery.
Gosh. And presumably on your travels, it must have been very challenging to get people to speak. How did you manage to persuade them?
Well, Mauritania was the worst in that sense. And I think I was being passed on to, 4 separate police officers in the airport in Nouakchott, because I certainly wasn't going to say I was a journalist. So I said, I'm a historian. And they that kind of set them off on, what are you doing here? What are you looking at? And I said, I'm looking at Mauritanian society. But the one thing you can't really say is I'm here to investigate modern slavery, because you're not going to get past the airport. I met a very good journalist who was able to take me through a series of interviews. And fortunately for me, he was a very courageous individual who owned his own media outlet and said, I'm not scared of any of the authorities. But we were followed throughout. And, this is not a place you can report easily or freely. So that was probably the most difficult environment in which to research this topic. It's very contentious. It's formally illegal, but everyone knows it still exists, and they don't want people coming in to look at it.
How do you hope that Captives and Companions will change the way that we think and talk about slavery and its legacy?
Well, I hope that people will take away from it a sense, I suppose, of the global aspect of slavery as an institution. And in the book, I talk about that it's important to not talk about this as the Muslim slave trade. We talk about the Atlantic slave trade. We don't talk about the Christian slave trade. So I hope that it points to that. And I discussed the ancient China, Egypt, Greece, that sort of global aspect of it. But I think more broadly, maybe, I hope that it's informative and brings to life a relatively unknown or even forgotten and certainly neglected story. A really important historical narrative, which involved many millions of people, like the Atlantic slave trade, but just for various reasons, which we've also discussed, is just much less well known in the West.
It's part of your contention that human beings have had slavery as an institution for far, far, far longer than we haven't had it, and it was more or less universal at one point. Is that fair to say?
But I was thinking of geographically, especially how in the West, when, if you Google slavery and the slave trade, what typically comes up will be the Atlantic almost always, and in an overwhelming sort of, quantity and detail. And this aspect of the story, which I think is comparable in terms of the numbers of, between, say, 14 and 17 million over 14 to 15 centuries. So marginally maybe more people enslaved than the Atlantic slave trade, but over a much longer period. So it's more diluted over a longer period. So it's just as important in that sense, but I think infinitely, less well known.
Obviously, there's a very noisy and important conversation about the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade in Anglo-America, and it's been quite wrenching, particularly in America. Is there a similar conversation going on in the Islamic world, for example?
I don't think we're quite there yet. I think in Turkey it's more advanced than elsewhere, and there is that new generation of scholars who are making really fascinating and important inroads into the story of Ottoman slavery, which is about, say, give or take 600 years old. From the birth of the Ottoman Empire through to its collapse around 1922. I think elsewhere in the Gulf, for example, I think that conversation it hasn't really begun. There is a museum to slavery in Doha, in Qatar. But I think, by Western standards, it's not quite confronting head-on the legacy. There's a community also of what are called Afro-Turks in Turkey who have written books and, gone into sort of a field of activism to, protest their rights and almost to ask the Turkish state, rather, to recognize that legacy of slavery. But I think it's coming. In Morocco, I used a couple of really interesting new historians as sources. Both of who use the word taboo. They said, it's taboo to discuss the story of slavery in Morocco, for example. So I think it's a mixed field, but it's in a different place from where we are in the West. And I don't think the word reparations is being heard at all.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Justin, and very, very best of luck in the next stages of the book prize.
Thank you very much, Toby. It's great fun.
We'd like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation, as always, for its continued and very generous support of this podcast. The winner, as I mentioned earlier, will be announced on the 4th of November at an awards ceremony in central London. That is also indeed generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. The announcement will be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction social channels. If you're interested in finding out more about the shortlisted books or about the prize in general, you can visit our website or follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok at BG Prize. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.